Welcome to the first of 3 housing deep dives. My name is Marva Galawilo, and I'm the new Learning and Member Engagement Specialist. A few housekeeping items before we jump in. Next slide. First, as a continuing SVCN practice, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the land that each of us are on today. In San Jose, California, we are living, learning, and organizing on the land of the Muwekma and Tamian Ohlone tribes. Together, let us commit to educating ourselves and advocating for Indigenous peoples, communities neglected and displaced by the US government, and other colonial powers across the world. I know people here are tuning in from different areas, so I encourage you to learn what land you're living on by using the website we'll share in the chat, and share that information in your introduction. While we continue to go through today's guidelines, we'd love to learn who is in the room with us. Please introduce yourselves in the chat by sending your name, title and organization, pronouns, and native land. We will recap the items to share. Next slide. For accessibility purposes, we do have the automated closed captioning feature in Zoom activated. Now with this, you do have the ability to move the captions around on your screen to a place more convenient, or you can disable the closed captioning feature entirely if you prefer to not have it up. To do so, please reference the bar at the bottom of your Zoom, click on live transcript on the right, and then click hide subtitles. If you're having any tech or other troubles during the session, please private message Dana directly in the chat. We do ask that you remain on mute throughout the program and use the chat to send questions. Next slide. Next slide. We're continuing with this housing series next week, where we'll cover nonprofit and community ownership of land. Registration is open. And with that, I'd like to pass it to Nick Kawada, Policy Director for SVCN.
Thanks, Marva. And hello, everybody. My name is Nick Kawada, Policy Director of Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits. Preferred pronouns he, him. And I'm excited to welcome you to SVCN's Housing A to Z series. This discussion began a couple weeks ago during our yearly policy summit, Activate Your Impact, where we got a chance to hear from advocates on a variety of housing issues. And today, we kick off our deeper dive to help our community understand and navigate the sometimes seemingly complex housing policy landscape so that nonprofits can take action and more meaningfully participate in these discussions. Next slide, please. Thanks. I'd like to first draw your attention to what we heard from organizations during our nonprofit survey. 78% of all respondents informed us that affordable housing was a critical issue for our community. 78%, that is monumental. With that in mind, we want to tackle 3 key housing issues to ensure that nonprofit leaders and their constituents understand the components of the big housing policy decisions that our local governments will be making, and to have the tools to engage knowledgeably as advocates on these issues. So today we are discussing the housing element process, where cities plan for affordable housing every 7 years. And I'd like to introduce our panelists, and please forgive me, I'm gonna be doing this at the same time as I'm speaking, but we're gonna invite to the stage Aaron. Let's see here. Let's see if I can find you, Aaron. Where are you? There you are, Aaron. There you go. Aaron Eckhouse from California YIMBY. We got Kalisha. Where are you, Kalisha? There you are. Who is from Housing Choices. And then Nadia Aziz, you are right here from the Law Foundation of Silicon Valley. And Nadia, I believe you're going to actually start us off with the first, explain to us what the 3 Ps are. So I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks. If you can go to the next slide. So a few years ago, there was a large Bay Area wide process where a bunch of stakeholders got together and really tried to answer, how do we solve this housing crisis? And as a result of that process, this 3 Ps framework came out of it. And it was these 3 things that we have to do to solve the housing crisis. And the first is to produce more housing. We definitely need more housing, especially for our lower income families. The second is to preserve affordable housing. There's a ton of affordable housing and what we call naturally occurring affordable housing that's disappearing, whether that's subsidized property, rent control property, mobile homes. And so in order for us to solve the housing crisis, we also have to preserve affordable housing. And then lastly, we got to protect tenants from displacement and preventing homelessness. And we do that through eviction protections, through tenant protections, through legal services for tenants who are facing eviction. So it's that you'll hear throughout this presentation, we may refer to the 3 Ps, and the production, preservation, protection, those are the 3 Ps that we're talking about. So I'll hand it off to Aaron, who will do the introduction to the housing element.
Thanks, Nadia. Thanks, Silicon Valley Council of Nonprofits. Great to be here. I'm Aaron Eckhouse from California, YIMBY. And I think the housing element is a very exciting time for the Bay Area as all of the cities are updating this. And it's an incredibly high leverage moment to shape housing policy for the next decade. Next slide, please. So the housing element is where cities lay out their blueprint for how they're going to meet their housing needs. And it's notable, it's a piece of the general plan, and it's the one piece of the general plan with the strongest state oversight and accountability. I'm going to talk through some of the key components of it, and then some different types of cities and ways to engage with them. This is not a comprehensive look at the elements of a housing element, but these are the ones that I think are most important to understand as an advocate, which are the sites inventory, programs and policies, affirmatively furthering fair housing. Actually, Nadia is going to cover that later. And the fact that there's accountability from the State Department of Housing and Community Development through this process. Next slide. So the sites inventory is, I think, one of the most prominent pieces of a housing element. It's one of the ones that cities often struggle the most with. And it's effectively the city has to identify parcel by parcel where they can have capacity to build enough housing to meet their needs. Those needs are determined through a process called the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. It's a two-step process. First, the state gives each region, including the Bay Area, a total for how much housing they need to plan for over the 8-year planning period. That's divided into 4 income levels: very low income, moderate income, and above moderate income. And then the Association of Bay Area Governments came up with a methodology to divvy that up across every jurisdiction in the Bay Area. This part of the process is largely concluded, but it's really important because it determines how much housing a city has to plan for. They have to show that they have zone capacity to meet their housing needs at all of those income levels. And this is a really critical step because some cities will identify good sites and some cities will identify bad sites, and most cities will identify a mix of good and bad sites. Whether they're good or not depends on the location. Is this a good place for us to be planning for more homes? Is it near transit? Is it near jobs? Is it near services? Or does it perpetuate sprawl and segregation and concentration of low-income housing in polluted areas? And it's based on whether that site is likely to be redeveloped over the planning period. What is the current use? How likely is that use to be discontinued? And there are actually new state regulations for how cities have to address that. Next slide. The sites inventory isn't the only piece of the housing element. It's also an opportunity for every city to take a comprehensive review of their housing policies, look at what is working well and what is working poorly. And it's a chance for us as advocates to break out our housing policy wish lists and tell cities, hey, we really wish you would do this or that. This is an opportunity to make cities commit to making those changes. This can be for any of the 3 Ps that Nadia addressed. We can look at production policies, tenant protection, preservation. I want to emphasize this is preservation of affordable housing. It doesn't do any good to just preserve your housing stock for the sake of preserving the existing homes. It's about preserving the homes that are currently occupied by lower income residents. And this is something, as part of the housing element, cities have to do an analysis of constraints on housing production, including governmental constraints. So looking at which of their policies may be a barrier to building enough housing to meet their needs. If they identify something like minimum parking requirements or an uncertain permitting process as a constraint on housing, they should commit to a policy change to address that constraint. Next slide. And then all of this in this current cycle has to be done through the lens of affirmatively furthering fair housing. Nadia is going to go into more detail about that, so I won't go too much into it. I'll just say this is a critical piece of the housing element, and it's something that has really been strengthened in this cycle compared to previous years. There's going to be a much stronger focus from the state on making sure that cities are affirmatively furthering fair housing. Next slide. So different cities have sort of different needs from an advocacy perspective on housing elements. I think of 2 major types of cities. So one are cities that have either on council or from staff some strong pro-housing leadership in place. These are cities where you can really push them to be proactive and again, turn to your housing policy wish list and push for them to adopt policies from that will go beyond just doing the minimum that they need to do to get certified by the state and pursue really strong housing policies. So, there are cities, certainly cities in Santa Clara County that I think would fall into that category. I think there are other cities in Santa Clara County where the focus really needs to be on accountability and on making sure that those cities are, historically, some cities have tried to make the housing element a paper exercise where they check all the boxes on paper, but it doesn't actually create a viable plan to meet their housing needs. The state wants to be exercising stronger scrutiny, but they need help from local advocates who have local knowledge about what is going wrong in this city, what does the city need to do better, and especially for the sites inventory, which are the good and the bad sites. Next slide. So in a city where you have pro-housing leadership to work with, I think it's really valuable to engage as early as you can in the process and try to get your ideas embedded into the drafts as early as possible so the city can review them. It's great to meet with council members. A lot of these cities have put together stakeholder bodies to advise on the housing element. It's great to participate in those hearings. Send in letters where you say, hey, this is what we would like to see your city do in the housing element process. Again, this can be policies for any of the 3 Ps, but it's worth noting a lot of cities in the Bay Area, this process is underway already. So it's definitely now is the time to start thinking about this and getting involved. Next slide. In terms of thinking about what are some policies that you could pursue, these are some of the ones that come to mind for me, but it's far from a comprehensive list. I've grouped them into the 3 Ps. I think, we know slow and uncertain permitting processes can be a big barrier for housing, and especially affordable housing. That's something that cities can commit to addressing through the housing element process. We know that our zoning standards are not always consistent with our values today and with our current housing needs. Cities should commit to updating their zoning as part of the housing element process. I've heard of some cities that have said they think they can do a housing element with no rezoning, and that is not credible to me. That's effectively saying that the land use policy status quo is adequate, which I don't think is correct. Very few cities are producing housing at the rate that is necessary to meet their housing needs over the next 8 years. And again, there's a primary focus in the housing element process on producing adequate housing for cities' needs, but it's not the only part of the housing element process, and cities can absolutely commit to tenant protection and affordable housing preservation policies through this. I'll talk a little about the SB 330 checklist. There's a requirement now under state law that any development that replaces existing rent-controlled housing or housing that is occupied by low-income renters needs to replace that housing that is demolished and provide an opportunity for the current residents to return. A lot of cities, though, aren't incorporating that requirement strongly enough into their development process. I think they could be doing a better job in their permitting forms, providing checklists for developers to make sure the developers are aware of that requirement and have a plan to meet it. Next slide. Now, not every city has that same opportunity to pursue some of the forward-thinking policies like parking reform or missing middle zoning changes. But they still have to produce a housing element. And that's really important. It means doing nothing is not really an option in this case. And they have to show that they have adequate zone capacity. Accountability from local advocates who know what is happening in this community, who can evaluate sites and say, hey, that's a really popular business on that site. Why are you claiming it's going to be redeveloped? Or, hey, you left out this empty parking lot that nobody ever uses. Why can't we develop that with an apartment building? That kind of knowledge is really valuable, and the state wants to hear it. So I think when you're looking at a city with accountability, a city like Cupertino, where the planning commissioners are suggesting, well, hey, can we build our housing underground so we don't have to offend the sensibilities of the neighbors with regards to height? I don't think the state is going to allow them to do underground housing. That's less of a concern, but it speaks to a certain mindset. And it's something where I think you really want to be reviewing hey, are you concentrating all of your affordable housing in one part of the city that's next to the freeway or industrial uses where those residents are going to have to be dealing with pollution? Are you creating opportunities for affordable housing to be in every neighborhood and give people access to the best schools in your community? And are you picking sites that are real good places for development that aren't, demolishing an existing apartment building and replacing it without significant gain? So I think there are real opportunities to hold cities that have bad track records on housing accountable through the housing element process. Next slide. So last pieces here. One is that this is not a process that you have to do alone. There are a lot of groups, including all of our groups here, working on the housing element process. And I encourage you to connect with them. A couple of specific places to go to learn more. fairhousingelements.org is a coalition that California YIMBY is a member of, working on housing elements. They have a lot of great resources, including a calendar of upcoming events across the region for housing elements. The other groups on this webinar, as well as Silicon Valley at Home, are often doing housing element work, and I encourage you to connect with us. Your local planning department can give you an update on where they are in the process and what upcoming opportunities to participate are going to be. And then I'm always happy to talk. So there's my email. Feel free to send me an email if you have questions about what are effective ways to advocate in the housing element process. And I would love to have a conversation with you about that. Again, I think this is a really high leverage opportunity. So often as housing advocates, we encounter situations where the easiest thing for a city to do is nothing, but they don't really have the option of not doing a housing element. This is required by the state. They are going to face consequences from the state if they don't submit an adequate housing element. And so this is an opportunity for all of us to make sure that as cities plan for the next 8 years, they're doing that well. And I had a request to ask about upcoming deadlines. So January of 2023 is the deadline for cities in the Bay Area to submit a final draft of their housing element to the State Department of Housing and Community Development. Most cities in the Bay Area are planning to submit their initial drafts much earlier than that because there are new requirements for them to publish those drafts with 30 days for public input. And then they might have to wait, probably will have to wait 60 days to get a response to their draft from the state. And then they need to revise the draft and publish again with the 30 days to wait for public input, then wait again to hear back from the state. So expect cities to be publishing their early drafts sometime in the second half of this year. And they then will have a 120-day grace period after January of 2023 in which to get their housing element certified before they fall out of compliance and start facing consequences like losing potentially their local land use authority, having that be superseded. Okay, Nadia.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about affirmatively furthering fair housing. So the phrase affirmatively furthering fair housing actually comes from the Fair Housing Act, which was passed in 1968. It was an important piece of civil rights legislation. It was something Dr. King was working to try to get passed. It was signed shortly after his assassination. And the purpose of the Fair Housing Act was really to ensure that everyone had fair access and equal access to housing. And it was to remedy some of the past historical segregation that existed. We know that a lot of these policies that have led us to where we are right now in terms of segregation were intentional. A lot of us have read Color of Law. We know that there was intentional redlining, intentional zoning, intentionality into the communities where we live now that are very segregated. And if we think about from 1968 to 9, we're still in a 1968 to now, we're still in a very, very segregated community. So a lot of times when we think about housing discrimination in the Fair Housing Act, we're thinking about, someone who's faced discrimination, something that we're thinking about remedying something that's happened. But a part of the Fair Housing Act, and that's very explicit in the Fair Housing Act, is that cities have an obligation to affirmatively further fair housing, which means that they have an affirmative obligation to take actions to remedy that past segregation. They have to, take on duties, fix basically these past actions. And as we know, for the past 50 years, cities haven't been doing that. So as part of the city's obligations to affirmatively further fair housing, they had to, for many years, do what's called an analysis of impediments to fair housing choice. The Obama administration tried to make that planning document a little bit more robust and do what's called an assessment of fair housing. The Trump administration basically nicked that rule and reversed it. But what ended up happening is that at the state level, there was legislation that passed that put this AFFH requirement into the housing element. So that's why we're here now talking about the obligation to affirmatively further fair housing. And so as part of the housing element, cities and jurisdictions have to do this analysis where they look at patterns of segregation, where they look at where people are living, where there are racial and ethnic concentrations of poverty. So they have to analyze it, but then they also have to talk about what actions they're going to take to address it. So specifically, this is from the HCD website. The cities have to address significant disparities in housing needs and in access to opportunity. Second, replace segregated living patterns with truly integrated and balanced living patterns, transform racial and ethnic concentrated areas of poverty into areas of opportunity, and foster and maintain compliance with civil rights and fair housing laws. So this analysis must be part of the housing element. So I'm going to go to the next page. Sorry guys, my kids just came home from school, so it's a little bit loud here. So that AFFH analysis has to include the fair housing issues in the jurisdiction, and analysis and data on segregation patterns. There's actually maps that cities have to produce. What are contributing factors? So are high rents a reason that that our communities are so segregated? We talk a lot. We have in our county vouchers as a main way for extremely low income people to be able to stay here. Are the fair market rents that the voucher program look at, is that perpetuating segregation by only allowing people to rent in very particular areas? So these are the type of factors that need to be analyzed as part of an AFFH. And then the city has to actually identify fair housing goals and actions, including where they're going to put affordable housing and housing in general. Erin mentioned the sites analysis that has to happen as part of the housing element. There has to be an AFFH analysis. So, is all of the housing that's being developed in areas where there's already concentrations of poverty or that's already racially and ethnically segregated? If that's the case, then that's something that we as advocates should be pushing back on. And rezoning, like Erin mentioned, should also be considered when thinking about affirmatively furthering fair housing. Another thing I just want to mention is something that we as nonprofit advocates should be thinking about when it comes to both the housing element and our obligation to affirmatively further fair housing is NIMBYism. This phenomenon of like neighbors saying that they don't want housing in their backyard, they don't want affordable housing here, they don't want people who are unhoused being in their communities. At the Law Foundation, we've always stated that NIMBYism should be analyzed as an impediment to fair housing and as a constraint in the housing element. And I think it's important for us to recognize and talk about that and have cities really analyze how they're going to overcome NIMBYism as an impediment to fair housing. Okay, next slide. Okay, so a little bit about AFFH, a little bit about housing element. So why does it matter? Like what can come out of a housing element? So as advocates, we can be advocating for policies in the housing element that actually get implemented. And so I just want to highlight two of those policies that we've historically worked on at the Law Foundation along with other community partners. So want to give two examples from the city of San Jose. One is inclusionary zoning. And for those of you who don't know what inclusionary zoning is, it's a requirement to require affordable units, whether it's rental housing or for sale housing, is part of any new development. And so this is something that we and other advocates were advocating that the city put into their housing element. And once the city put it as a goal or a program in their housing element, we as advocates were like, well, you put it in your housing element, now you got to implement it. And so, when you are advocating for something in the housing element, it's something that you can then, after the housing element's passed, push the city to do. And so that's something that we push the city to do. It's in your housing element, you said you would do it. And eventually the city of San Jose passed an inclusionary zoning program for both for sale and eventually rental housing as well. Source of income discrimination is another win that we got at the policy level. It's something that we advocated for both in the housing element and in the city's what was called the analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, now the AFH. And so source of income discrimination basically means that you can't discriminate against someone or can't decide not to rent to someone just because they have a Section 8 voucher or another type of housing assistance. And so it was something that we were seeing as an impediment to people being able to access housing and to access housing in higher opportunity areas. And so, something that we push for to get into these planning documents. And then once the city put it in their planning documents, it's something that we were able to emphasize, like you put it in your housing element, you put it in your analysis of impediments to fair housing choice, you have to actually pass this ordinance. And so anytime the housing department actually put out a memo related to this source of income discrimination, it was in there. We said we would do this as part of our housing element. We analyzed this as a constraint to fair housing. And so this is why the housing element is an important tool, because once something's in the housing element, it's almost like an obligation that a jurisdiction has. And so it's a great opportunity for us as advocates to really push the cities to get strong housing elements and then push those policies as something that's an obligation for those cities. So that's one way that the housing elements matter are important. Next slide. And another way it's important is because of the enforcement mechanism. So HCD can enforce the housing elements. They can approve and disapprove them. And also the state can actually sue a jurisdiction, which happened with Huntington Beach. But people can file lawsuits. Advocates can file lawsuits. The community can file lawsuits. And there's different reasons why you might want to file a lawsuit related to the housing element. One, if a city fails to enact a housing element, that's a basis for a lawsuit. If their housing element fails to comply with state law, but the state approves it anyway, which has happened before, that's a reason to file a lawsuit. But something that's more common is that a city takes an action that's inconsistent with its housing element. So for example, the housing element says that we need to build X amount of units of affordable housing, but if a jurisdiction takes an action and disapproves an affordable housing development, or in a case that I worked on in Palo Alto, they approved the closure of a mobile home park that violated its housing element. There was some language in the housing element that said they would take actions to preserve this mobile home park. And so we were able to bring a housing element case, a housing element claim in that case to try to preserve the park. And we were ultimately successful and the park was preserved. So that's another reason why housing elements are important, because we see a lot of NIMBYism. We hear about people who are opposed to housing using litigation or trying to use litigation to try to stop development. This is a way for us those of us who are housers, those of us who want to see more integrated communities, to use the courts, to use the law to try to get more housing and to support the actions or oppose the actions of cities who won't do what they need to. Next slide. So there's also several penalties for violating the housing elements. One is attorneys' fees and costs, which is important for us as lawyers, but it's also a big hammer for cities to, who may be threatened with litigation or lawsuits, and it's something that cities consider when considering actions that might violate their housing element. The court can take away a city's permitting authority if they violate their housing element, which means that a city can't approve or disapprove housing anymore. And so that is a huge hammer if a city violates its own housing element, or if a court finds that a city violates its housing element. There are now pretty significant financial penalties. If a city is found to violate its housing element, a court can order penalties of up to $100,000. The court can appoint a receivership, which means the court makes decisions about what gets approved and what doesn't get approved. And they can also order a streamlined ministerial approval process, which means things get approved at a much quicker basis. So there's a lot of really serious penalties for cities who violate their housing element, and if a court finds that they do violate their housing element. So these are some things that, as us as nonprofits, if things that we're seeing in our community, cities disapproving or delaying the development of housing, definitely something to think about. You can reach out to me at the Law Foundation. We've done housing element litigation before. But yeah, it's a very, very powerful tool. Next slide. I think that's Kalisha now.
So thank you to Nadia and to Erin for that brief introduction into the housing element process. My name is Kalisha Webster, and I'll be talking about how the organization I work with has been engaging in the housing element update process throughout the 5 counties that we serve to get everyone thinking about how you too can get involved. State law requires that as part of their housing elements, all cities complete an analysis of special housing needs for certain groups facing increased housing barriers, such as seniors, persons with disabilities, including a developmental disability, large families, farm workers, female-headed households, and the unhoused. However, in past housing element cycles, we have found many cities have data on the housing needs of people with developmental disabilities and plans to address those needs, which are lacking or completely missing. This is partly due to the lack of direct engagement with this population, which prevents city planners from developing a holistic understanding of the housing challenges faced by people with developmental disabilities and creating policies and programs which specifically address these barriers. Many people with a developmental disability, which can affect cognitive and other functional areas, find their city's housing element outreach process, including community meetings and surveys, are not accessible to them. In our role as an advocacy group, Housing Choices has looked for alternative ways to make sure their voices are heard. We see the housing element as an extremely important part of making sure that we build more inclusive communities. Even though cities may not build the housing themselves, the housing element creates a framework by which we can hold cities accountable to meeting the housing needs of all residents. Housing Choices was founded 25 years ago by parents and service providers of people with developmental disabilities who saw a need for more inclusive community housing. Today, we continue to promote the voices of people with developmental and other disabilities to educate local elected officials, city and county housing staff, and housing developers about their housing needs and opportunities to create more accessible housing. In addition to our housing advocacy work, we also provide direct client services to clients referred to us by the San Andreas and Golden Gate regional centers. We support individuals with developmental disabilities wanting to live independently, as well as families that include a person with a developmental disability throughout their housing journey, including both housing navigation and retention. Much of our housing retention work is done on-site at affordable housing developments, where we have partnered with affordable housing developers and the regional centers to create inclusive housing for people with developmental disabilities. Next slide. So what is a developmental disability? Developmental disabilities are a group of conditions onset during the developmental period prior to age 18, which can affect cognitive, social, physical, and other functional areas, and severely impairs the ability to live in the community without coordinated supportive services. This can include intellectual disability, autism, Down syndrome, epilepsy, cerebral palsy, and other disabling conditions similar in their functional impact to an intellectual disability. Under California's Lanterman Act, the state's 21 regional centers fund the services people with developmental disabilities require to live successfully in their communities. State and federal laws mandate that a person with a developmental disability should have access to the services needed to live in the least restrictive setting of their choosing. But because the regional center's funding is limited only to the provision of services, it cannot be used to supplement consumers' typically limited income to afford the cost of housing. Next slide. The Department of Developmental Services estimates that less than 15% of California residents with developmental disabilities are gainfully employed. Instead, most are dependent on fixed incomes of around $1,000 per month from disability benefits such as supplemental security income, putting them well below the extremely low income threshold of 30% of area median income. Those that do work are typically working part-time in low-wage jobs. And according to a recent report from the Turner Center, less than 20% of extremely low-income renters in the Bay Area receive a housing subsidy. Because housing subsidy programs such as Section 8 are not designed to meet the needs of all low-income renters, and because disability benefits programs do not pay a livable income, we find that in each city where we are advocating for inclusive housing, more than 80% of adults with developmental disabilities are living at home with family or in group homes, not by choice, but because of the lack of deeply affordable housing. In order to promote independence and prevent displacement or homelessness for members of the community with developmental disabilities, it is critical that every city develop programs and policies which respond to their specific housing needs in the city's housing element. Next slide. Cost is not the only barrier that people with developmental disabilities find in accessing independent housing within their communities. Currently, the largest provider of housing for adults with developmental disabilities is a parent or other family member. However, with longer lifespans, many more adults are outliving their parents than in prior decades. In addition, beginning in the mid-1980s, there was a significant annual increase in the diagnosis of autism, which did not level out until 2015. These two factors have contributed to a faster rate of growth in the number of people with developmental disabilities as compared to the general population. Historically, a person with a developmental disability who could not live at home with family was forced to live in crowded, segregated licensed care facilities or group homes. However, changes in state and federal law now entitle them to receive community-based services needed to live independently in integrated housing. Best practices have also evolved to significantly limit the number of residents allowed to live in the remaining licensed care homes. With a decline in both supply and demand of licensed care facilities, they no longer can be expected to meet the housing needs of people with developmental disabilities who are unable to live in their family home. All of these factors are leading to significant displacement of people with developmental disabilities out of the high-cost counties that we serve. Displacement, or even worse, homelessness, present a much greater risk of harm to people with developmental disabilities, as they depend on familiarity with safely navigating transit routes on their own, as well as access to support systems developed both formal and informal over the years while living in their home communities. Next slide. As part of our housing element advocacy, we have been asking cities to focus on some practical guidelines in order to meet the housing needs of people with developmental disabilities. Our goal is for each city to commit to developing a quantifiable number of extremely low income units with a preference for people with developmental and other disabilities who would benefit from coordinated on-site supportive services funded by the regional center. These on-site supportive services would increase accessibility by helping residents with developmental and other disabilities to understand their rights and uphold their responsibilities as tenants so that they can maintain safe and stable housing. Integrating these units into typical affordable housing, where no more than 25% of units are set aside for people with developmental disabilities, would also affirmatively further fair housing for a group that has historically experienced few alternatives to segregated living. Because most people with developmental disabilities do not drive, we also ask that these units be included in projects in transit-rich areas. In addition, because the severity of a person's disability and level of support needed can vary, a mix of unit sizes is needed. For a person wanting to live independently and who requires only limited support, a studio or one bedroom could fit their needs. However, for those that require 24/7 assistance from a live-in aide to perform activities of daily living, a 2-bedroom unit would best fit their housing needs. We also see that as people with developmental disabilities integrate into the community, they have an increased desire to get married and start families of their own. Next slide. While state tax credit regulations require the inclusion of units for people with mobility and hearing impairments, no such accessibility requirements exist for people with developmental disabilities who also need these affordable units. There are also no state funds targeted to providing housing for people with developmental disabilities, as there are with other special needs populations, which would incentivize affordable housing developers to include the deeply affordable units needed by people with developmental disabilities in their housing plans. This is why it is up to cities to set their own housing targets to meet the needs of people with developmental disabilities in their city. Cities should go beyond describing the need and actually create and implement policy, zoning, program, and other changes that make it more feasible for affordable housing developers to include people with developmental disabilities in their housing plans. Some of the general policies that all cities can implement are awarding competitive advantage for city land and financing to project proposals which include people with developmental disabilities, reduce parking for transit-oriented projects which include people with developmental disabilities, and local development standards, concessions, or incentives which reduce construction costs beyond the state density bonus law if they include extremely low income units. Next slide. As an organization, some of the work that Housing Choices is doing to make sure cities are aware of the housing needs of the members of their community with developmental disabilities is providing city-specific data of regional center consumers, residence type, which provides evidence of the extremely low number of adults able to transition into independent living. We are also collaborating with other special needs populations to find out what policies and programs they would like to see their cities adopt to find ways that we can combine our advocacy efforts, most notably as a member of the 21 Elements Equity Advisory Group in San Mateo County. And we have had one-on-one meetings with city planners to find out what policies and programs are already being considered in their housing elements to strategize on ways they can add more inclusive language, which could generate housing for more special needs populations. But our main strategy remains to amplify the voices of self-advocates, as we find that more than data and ideas about policy, the most compelling information we can bring to cities is the real life stories of people living in the communities they serve. Next slide. We are implementing a number of different strategies to increase accessibility of the housing element process for people with developmental disabilities. We are hosting workshops for self-advocates, their families, and service providers to get them energized and thinking about how the housing element directly affects their ability to live independently. From these workshops, we are recruiting advocates to attend meetings in their city and tell their housing stories. In order to prepare advocates for these meetings, we are planning to offer trainings on how to effectively tell your housing story. We have also developed email lists of advocates in each city that we can alert to upcoming meetings with specific instructions on how to join the meeting and with draft talking points and sample emails to easily submit written public comment. As part of our role on the Equity Advisory Group, we have also been providing small stipends to self-advocates willing to submit their housing stories to city planning staff in written, verbal, or video format. You can visit our website at housingchoices.org to see some of the housing stories we have collected so far. Next slide. And if your organization is interested in collaborating on policies and programs to increase production of extremely low income housing, please do feel free to contact me. My email is here, Kalisha@housingchoices.org.
Thank you so much, Kalisha, and thank you so much, panelists, for all of your great insights. We actually finished in record time, so wanted to open it up for some additional questions from the folks here in the chat. We also actually have some questions from Reg Fox, but you give credit to the people who show up. So we're going to start with the people here in the chat. Is there anyone who has any questions? Either you raise your hand or put it in the chat, please. All right, looks like Matthew Tinsley. Did you want to start first?
Sure, thanks, Nick. Hi, everybody. My name's Matt Tinsley. My work is around early childhood education. And one of the questions that we're really interested in is how do we connect best with affordable housing advocates to work on including early learning facilities in affordable housing development. We know that this is a big need. both for people living in housing developments, but also the community more broadly. So, but we don't know anything about housing and housing policy and how to make that connection. So what are a couple of first steps that we should be taking?
I'll answer that. So, I mean, and feel free, Erin or Felicia, to jump in. So I think that, so one way to do that is you'll see like different cities have like housing element workshops, or sometimes you'll see surveys. So I would just keep on the lookout for those types of things. And I think that, you know, showing up to the meetings, writing letters, submitting comments about, you know, trying to get education or early education into the affordable housing would be a great way to do that. Another place I would suggest going is, I know Destination Home has, I guess I don't know if it's called a task force, but they have a like a coalition that's called Housing Ready Communities, where they really talk about affordable housing and how to bring affordable housing into communities, especially communities who have traditionally been hesitant to have affordable housing in their communities. And so I think that's a great place to start and to learn about the affordable housing community. If you go on their website, you can find out when the next meetings are, because I think that'll give you a good connection to that community. Sorry, and Erin and or
Yeah.
Felicia or Nick, I don't know if you have things to add.
All I think is 1.5 more things. The half is just, I think this is a good thing to talk with affordable housing developers about, and like, you know, to work with them directly on incorporating this into their plans. But also, and I don't know, this idea feels a little silly to me, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. Cities have density bonuses, right? Where you can get, the development gets additional density and concessions from certain restrictions in exchange for providing on-site affordable housing. You could structure a density bonus around anything that the city wants. So if a city wanted to add a stackable density bonus for providing on-site childcare in a development, that's something that they could do. Say, hey, you know, you can add 10 or 20% greater density, you can get a relief from a setback standard. If you provide this community amenity that we all agree is really critical, my sense from talking to people who are seeking childcare is like, it's even more absurd than housing costs in the Bay Area. So that could be another.
It's comparable levels of absurdity, let me put it that way. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, I think Nadia and Erin both made great points. I'll just expand. Just if you are interested in getting engaged in the housing element process in your city, the best way to do that, most cities have their own website. You can kind of Google that, your city housing element. If they don't have their own dedicated website for it, you just kind of have to take a look at Planning Commission and City Council agendas as they're released usually every Friday, and see what's coming up on the next week's agenda to see if there's anything where you can plug in.
Thank you. My internet status is supposed to be. Thank you for the question, and sorry, folks, if I cut anyone off while I was speaking. Freaking out there for a second. There was actually a question.
Nick, your mic static.
No, it's not working. Okay.
Yeah, maybe actually if Marva or Jana can see the questions that are in our script from the registration process, can read those, one of those. I was actually going to ask Kylie, not to put you on the spot, Kylie or Kate Conley, you submitted questions in the chat. You're in your registration. You're welcome to ask that right now, or we can ask it on your behalf. All right, I'll ask the ones that I see in the document. So we have, how can nonprofits partner to advocate for and create policies related to the housing element?
I think one is, you know, continuing to communicate and connect with one another. Again, there are a lot of, like, I really encourage folks to connect with some of the groups that are, if you're thinking about, hey, how can we get involved in the housing element process? Like, there are groups who are working on that and are happy to talk with other organizations that want to get more involved, right? Like we welcome that. I think it's super valuable. Like a lot of housing groups have really plugged into this, but sometimes cities, they hear the same old housing advocates saying the same old things. And when it's a new voice, not one of the usual suspects, they will take extra notice. And then, cities are having public process around their housing elements right now. And you really can just show up to that and say, hey, we care about the housing crisis. We want you to, take this seriously and do more. And even just that is an important part of the message for them to hear. That again, it's not just housing elements who are taking this seriously and want them to be also taking it seriously. It's people in all parts of the community, and it's affecting everyone in the community.
Anyone have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to add, I mean, I think the other thing that is important is that us as nonprofits have connection to communities that sometimes cities and jurisdictions don't have. And so I think the other way that it's really important for us to get involved is to be the voice of that community, or even to connect people who may utilize your services to the process. So whether that's through, giving them data, or like what we're doing at the Law Foundation is actually doing our own surveys and, getting client feedback and hopefully providing that to the cities. And then we have our own data about who's coming to us and what issues. But I mean, I think all of us, like the housing element process really should be community-based, and there should be a robust public participation process, but not all cities are going to get that right. But I think for us, one key role that we can play is really bridging that so that the voices of people, especially who the cities don't hear from all the time, are actually being heard.
Thank you. There's a couple questions kind of around specific models and sample policies that folks are kind of asking your recommendations on. So one question is interested in models for successfully densifying single-family residential neighborhoods and democratizing home ownership, in addition to our lovely large multifamily affordable rental housing developments. Thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts on this, and I would love to follow up with this person. In terms of a model, I think Portland is the city that recently adopted changes for this that I look to as having the best ordinance. And they created incentives to add additional homes. You get a little extra flexibility the more homes you're putting on a lot. They have accessibility standards built into that. They have parking relief built into that, which is parking requirements are a huge obstacle to this kind of small scale multifamily infill development. I think something that also cities in California should really look at is allowing small lot sizes if they want to support homeownership in particular. Condoization in California is difficult and creates additional legal liabilities. But if you allow small lot subdivisions, you're getting the legally simplest form of homeownership as a possibility. And I think there are ways that cities could encourage that. The last thing I'll point to is most cities have existing examples of these housing types that they can look to as models, and they can look at what is currently in our zoning code that would prohibit that from being built today. And maybe we should change those rules that are outlawing buildings that already exist in our city and oftentimes are very beloved. Oh, and the last one. I think for that scale of development, by right ministerial approval is essential. You cannot ask somebody building a triplex to navigate the same approval process as somebody building a 7-story, 300-unit apartment building. It's just not going to work.
Can you decode the by right ministerial process for those people who are not total planning geeks? No offense.
The city should have objective rules, and if a development is consistent with those objective rules, it should be able to be approved by staff without a discretionary process and ideally with a defined timeline. ADUs are, I think, the gold standard example of this type of process in California.
I just want to just flag this. Homeownership is really a racial justice issue. I think, when we talk about generational wealth, a lot of that is tied up in the ability to own homes and the fact that we don't have really any affordability. It's almost impossible for many of us to afford a home. Really is a racial justice issue. So I just want to say that to recognize that. In addition to the things that Erin mentioned, there's also a lot of people really talking about alternative ways of trying to create homeownership opportunities, especially for communities of color and people who are low income, including models like land trusts. The city of San Jose is now looking at Community Opportunity to Purchase Act, which would allow for nonprofit and hopefully, if advocates are successful, tenant opportunity to purchase property, which is the next session as a plug. And so I think that, that there are people thinking and talking about alternative ways for us to bridge that home ownership gap, which is very much tied to generational wealth and racial equity in this country.
Thanks. Kalisha, any kind of closing thoughts before we wrap?
This is a really great time for people to really get engaged. I think Erin may have gone over it, but there's some, requirements for RHNA at different income levels. And, we're really trying to push cities to look at people who are the most in need at that ELI, who are most at risk of displacement or who are most at risk of homelessness. And so any of you who may be interested in working on that together, please do reach out.